All right. Launch week 11 just finished up and happy to be talking with the folks here at Turbot. So we have Nathan Wallace, who's our founder and CEO. We had John Smith, who's our lead product architect, and also Cody Bruno, who's our lead software architect. And I'm Bob Tordell, Help Manager Sales and Partnerships at Turbot. And just another great way to end the year with Launch Week 11 with some great new features and expanded scope of Turbot Guardrails, which was the main focus of this launch week. And just normal wrap party style, just going to take us through the week, ask some questions of folks here at Turbot to get some of their insights and perspectives of the week's announcements. So starting off Monday, really actually wasn't focused on any type of product features per se, but really just introducing the concept of prevention first security as well as PSPM, Preventive Security Posture Management. And with that, this is a kind of a bold move to try to bring together a new category and a new focus as well as new terminology. And so, Nathan, I wanted to start with you. What was the intent behind kind of framing this new suite of features that we announced this week around prevention first or, PSPM?
We've worked in this space for a long time, right? And one of the things from back in our prior jobs, right, we've always believed that the key thing is actually to fix problems and stop bad stuff from happening, right? But this is really hard, and teams are struggling with this, and they're just drowning in alerts because now everyone has fantastic visibility to what's going on in their environment through the various CNAP tools, etc. But it hasn't made it any easier to actually stop the flood of alerts and stop those bad things happening in the first place. And so we just really concentrating in on that problem harder, and how do we help you prevent those problems from happening in the first place, or spreading more quickly once they do go wrong. To invoke the AI thing, one of the things that's happening now is like when people breach your account and they're unleashing the agents, the idea that, oh well, there was a bad config, we sent an email to Jim, he'll get back to us in a couple of days and maybe we can fix something. This is all just way too slow and too much human effort, etc. So we've just decided we've got to really keep doubling down on this problem of how do we help people prevent things from happening, fix them automatically or quickly when they do happen. And so, that's where preventive security posture management comes in and really asks the question of not just what's wrong in my environment, how many unencrypted buckets do I have, but instead ask the question of what preventions do I have in place to stop that happening in the first place, right? How do I measure that as an organization? How do I improve that as an organization to get better and better at doing those things? And ultimately, there are two big outcomes from focusing on prevention. The first one, is that you reduce your risk. Every time you've got an open issue, that is not just an alert that it's annoying to chase up. If it's an actual security problem in your environment that you need to fix, otherwise you're at risk from having it, right? And so we have to reduce those down, not as in reduce our alerts, but actually reduce our risk. And the second one is like just the fatigue that comes from all of those different alerts and the time we spend on them. It's so much cheaper and easier to stop something happening in the first place than it is to fix it later, right? It's just sucks spending your job chasing people to fix things. And so we want to help teams, build those shields in the first place, build something positive in their environment to stop bad configurations, stop people making mistakes, and stop bad actors going rampant, right? And so, that's where the idea of PSPM, kind of really took hold in our minds. It was something we saw our customers trying to achieve and struggle with, like with so many options and tooling and complexity for creating that today. So we've doubled down into that, and I think we've built some really amazing tools and capabilities in the product to help people focus in the area where they'll have the most impact for their org.
And I think we got some early feedback around those ideas and concepts. Like, so actually, most of us on the call here were at Amazon reInvent.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we spoke to literally thousands of people
Yeah.
during that week. Anything like, as talking about prevention first or PSPM, anything that really stuck out in your conversations on like what resonated with folks?
A lot of people have good visibility at this point into their environment, and they've sort of achieved that, but what they're not able to achieve is fixing the actual problems or reducing the amount of new problems that come through. It's like at the end of the month, I'm talking to my boss, I'm like, it was great, we had like 1,000 alerts, we managed to burn it down to 800, but 210 new ones were created, so now we've got 1,010, right? And this is just not a satisfying outcome from that period of time. They didn't feel that they actually reduced their risk, right? And so when we talk to them about how PSPM really sits with the CNAP in your environment, one's giving you great visibility of what's going on, and the PSPM is giving you a good understanding of your preventive posture and how you can stop those things happening and how they could see that more clearly because it's really hard to see your preventions right now. They're kind of invisible. They happen, you hope, right? And they're in like 27 settings in different places with JSON dollar policies and other things. So it's hard to understand what's actually going on. So they totally grok why prevention is important. And they are struggling to understand how to do it better. And they could see how this really helps them solve that problem.
One of the things that we focused on was around like the educational materials to help you grok this as like a framework, as a initiative to get move your organization to be much more focused on prevention first as a strategy. And John, as someone who writes the most of the documentation within the company, probably if we look at the commits, you're probably leading that. Why the focus on also trying to build a library of free and open content around this problem? Maybe just give us some insights as someone that works on docs all the time. If you want to just give some perspective there on the library.
We're trying to change the perspective to some extent, right? The idea of being prevention forward, prevention first is somewhat novel. And so expressing the way we think about it and how we believe it should work, first of all, it helps people understand the decisions that were made in the product. Why do we have layers? Why do we have categories? Why do we choose these layers? Why do we choose these categories? Because we believe that, we want to give you a holistic view of prevention and that we don't have a holistic view today, and that prevention in depth, defense in depth is important. And there's reasons why you can do stuff at the build layer versus the access layer, and that part of the way the product is laid out reflects intentionally the decisions around how we think it should work or how we perceive the problem. Providing that documentation, I think, provides a framework for understanding why the product exists in the first place, why it's valuable to you, and what the problems are just generally, even without looking at our product, where some of the gaps are in that space today. It also helps you to pass that same information on to members of your team. A lot of times, you as a security professional or a cloud team member, you understand the value and it makes a lot of sense, but then you need to get buy-in from some other people. And I think a lot of those assets help not just get buy-in from our potential customers, but from their clients as well.
What Nathan was alluding to, I mean, one of the most common questions was like, how does this fit with my existing investments, my other security platforms like a CNAP? And so one of the library items is specifically answers that question in depth to help you, one, grok it, but two, be able to speak to others within your organization about why a PSPM tool is important and how it complements what you have. And this ties into Tuesday's announcements, is that, organizational policies in general are a bit invisible. They're, and like in an Amazon Web Services standpoint, in the org policies, there's, concept called service control policies, SCPs. They're stuck in the organization account, which very limited people rightfully only have access to. And then how they're applied is very difficult to understand. There's their nested JSON docs that then get applied and associated to different targets across your OU. How they're applied is really difficult to understand. If there's overlap, there's orphan ones. There might be overlapping rules or unexpected, unintended rules or exceptions made over time. And so essentially they're invisible, not only to like the administrators, but also for the folks that are downstream that get impacted by the policies by being blocked. One of the things just from a product strategy standpoint was, how do we take something that's invisible and make it much more interactive, visible, and something that you can actually work with through interactive reports? Cody, you've done a lot of work in just trying to bring that to life on trying to understand the like Amazon SCPs, for examples, into reports, into facts, into objectives. If you mind just kind of talking us through like, the challenges that you were, facing when you were building some of those features and working with the team there. And you just walk us through like what those objectives are, why is it important to kind of pull that information out?
As you mentioned, Bob, SCPs and other, I think there's 10 or 15 other policy types in general. Good capabilities in AWS organization policies, but also very complex and, like you said, invisible and kind of hard to, in a lot of cases, find what are the effective policies at different levels or different targets. Just looking at SCP in particular, very complex and powerful objects. For anyone familiar with IAM policies, they look very similar. There's multiple things, different types of effects, how you define the resources, conditions is a whole nother can of worms in there, and all of that is constantly evolving month over month. So kind of getting a hands on that, one being able to understand what's possible in SCPs, and then ultimately, like you mentioned, about how do we map those out to prevention objectives, prevention facts, creating examples on how to implement those, kind of taking SCPs, understanding them, and carrying them through those different levels is not easy. And I think that's why a lot of organizations struggle with that in terms of being able to how to understand that. Just in terms of some practical things, just kind of where we started on our journey as we were looking and really diving deep into SCPs. Step one was actually just kind of looking at SCPs and playing around with them and just exploring what's possible. Looking at a lot of common examples from AWS docs, there's a lot of GitHub repos or samples out there that AWS offers up, and there's a variety of other just users or people out there who have different blog posts or their own sample repos in terms of here's how to use this SCP with these types of conditions to achieve this sort of objective. So overall, there's a lot of activity out there and interest in wanting to use SCPs and create effective ones. But it's difficult and the information is very distributed. So for us to kind of, I think, look out there, understand it well, take that info and then try to consolidate or make sense of it, and ultimately then map it back to key objectives that we want to include within Guardrails and be able to show users in particular, hey, here are the important objectives or the high priority objectives that you should look at. And here's, and then taking, and then being able to kind of look at the recipes and interpret those and then match them to the different objectives or facts types, other prevention artifacts within Guardrails. The main challenge for me and the team were really just kind of looking at SCPs, understanding what's possible, and trying to find a really good set of examples or sample SCPs that we can then use to better our understanding and then match those to objectives and facts and other things in the system.
Yeah, like you said, there's SCPs, there's RCPs, there's EC2 declarative policies, there's another tagging policy type, what we call prevention types, at that layer around the access layer on things that you can to achieve blocking a risky API action. But having some type of natural language like association to like what these JSON policies are doing across these types are then mapping to something that you're trying to achieve. I mean, just really lifts kind of out that, code into something that you can actually rationalize and use. That then helps us be able to say, okay, how are you achieving this? You can then map those to the types, but then how well am I doing? So, part of the other announcements here was, okay, well, what can I do to improve? And part of that is to create a baseline. So you got these objectives that we're doing all this complex mapping for, and now it's like, well, how do you score it? And so, John, I know you were a big part of that kind of scoring system, looking across not only what you have, but where you can go further, and then trying to give some type of measure for that. So maybe if you don't mind just talking us through the scoring system within Guardrails.
First of all, the purpose of the scoring is to provide visibility into where you stand and to be able to analyze what to do next, right? So any sort of scoring is going to be somewhat arbitrary in nature. And the way that we do scoring reflects the way we think about the problem. Essentially, we want a way that you can view your scores in whatever cross-section you want to see them. So they need to be able to roll up in a way that's meaningful to you. Maybe you roll them up by tags, or maybe it's by the OU they're in, or maybe it's by the Turbot folder. So they need to be aggregatable. They also need to reflect what we believe is an accurate representation of the maturity of your prevention against a given objective in a given place. So essentially, the lowest level of granularity where we score is for a single objective, which is like a single prevention goal with a single prevention that we've mapped to it against a single account. And then when we roll those up to score the objective, there's a probabilistic OR algorithm that gives you an objective level score that considers all the preventions we found at the various layers to give you a score for that objective. That's partly because we think that prevention and death is important, number one, and that degree of effectiveness at different layers is potentially different, right? So if you catch something at the build layer, it's awesome because you catch it early. there's not really a guaranteed way to know that there's no path into the control plane of the cloud outside of that build prevention. So it doesn't get as high of a score as something at maybe the access layer, which is generally something like an organizational policy. Those impact everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a user or a service account or whatever. So those are weighted more highly. The scoring kind of reflects the idea of prevention in depth. So the more layers you cover, the higher your score will get. And certain layers get scored higher than other layers because they tend to be more effective. And then above that, once you have those set of scores, then you can average those scores out, whatever level that you want. And so, we have this idea of benchmarks, for instance, that organize objectives according to existing frameworks. You can kind of get your score by category or by account or for a given objective. And so you can really slice and dice the scoring now by getting a roll-up score once we've done all of the scoring. So, essentially, we try to get a good objective level score and then provide as many ways as possible for you to consume those and kind of take a look at your environment. We also use the scoring in the recommendations then. So the system also makes recommendations about what objectives to go after, and their score is a good part of how those recommendations get prioritized.
Yeah, that's a big part is, knowing where you are, but then where can you raise the bar, improve? And I think for those recommendations that you were just talking about, how are we using, how are we generating those recommendations? We're bringing in AI as, more and more into the product to help synthesize that information, help manage and recommend where to go next. Cody, if you don't mind just talking about, how we're using AI in the product for that in particular, and, how we're using it, maybe some interesting components of that feature itself.
Yeah, there's a couple places we use it. In particular, we started from a overall position of look at your environment, your configurations, what are we able to figure out, what do you have set up in place today? And there's a lot of stuff out there today that we can do more deterministically. And overall, I think that's a bit faster in some cases, and the information's just there. As an example, looking at your S3 public block settings or your EC2 account attributes, like blocking public AMIs. Things like that, where we know what the shape of the data looks like, we know how to interpret that and ultimately map that out to objectives or generate recommendations for those. And those are also well documented through and through. So overall, we found those fairly easy to kind of bring into the system and map to objectives and facts and whatnot. Where it got a bit tricky are the more complex resource types or policy types like SCPs and RCPs. There are bits and pieces that we're able to do a bit more deterministically. We know what the shape of the policy is and how to look for certain key actions or effects, things like that. But for the more complex policies, or as you start to layer on multiple statements within a policy across different levels across OUs, across accounts, in terms of how those policies get joined up and interpreted by AWS, very similar for Azure and GCP as well, where you can kind of attach them across different layers. That's where the complexity starts to come in. So that's where we look to AI to say, could we gather up the data, gather up the policies in the right shape, and then use AI to help us interpret what those policies are doing. And if we look at, for instance, at a specific account level, we could see really what is effectively being denied at this level from all the SCPs at the level or above. And what we found AI to be really good at was then interpreting those policies, even if you had multiple conditions with multiple effects and some statements looked like they were kind of colliding a bit or conflicting or maybe doing similar things. And when you bring in the idea of wildcarding and the resources and the actions, there's just a lot of possibilities of multiple statements together could be doing. So in particular, one I think key case was when looking at SCPs and RCPs coming out from users' environments, interpreting those, and then allowing us to do better matching against objectives and generate recommendations based off what we can see today and how it's able to help us interpret those.
And there's different nuances, everyone's environment, their current resources, all the layers of prevention. So yeah, AI is a great use case for us to kind of marry that dynamic nature of everyone's environment with recommendations based on best practices and examples that we have in order to recommend where you can go next. So yeah, really excited to see those features come in, and it kind of builds on some of the existing features that we had prior in prior launch weeks around intelligent assessments and summaries. So this is another good kind of path forward with leveraging AI in the product. On Wednesday, we introduced what we call the simulator. And actually, this is a combination of something we didn't talk about earlier, but one of the other announcements was around the SCP visualization, or your Amazon org visualization diagram, relationship graph, that you can overlay your SCPs. But we also came out with ways that you can then mock and simulate and test new SCPs or changes to SCPs. So huge feature set. And Nathan, I know this was a passion project for you early on, and so maybe just talk us through what is the simulator, and then maybe some interesting things that you worked on there.
The AWS SCP simulator allows us to see your whole organization structure with the OUs, root, and the accounts, etc., and then where SCPs are laid into that or attached into that environment, which is complicated. It's hard to get a picture of that, but now you can visualize that through the nodes, etc. And it does a good job about making that practical, like a 500 accounts under a thing, it'll collapse them and all that sort of stuff. So that does well. The big question that we often find from people is like, what's going to happen with this? Or why was this event blocked, right? Or if I change my SCP here, what would be the impact on my events or the way my organization and systems are working? We just have to make it way easier to understand that. So, for example, when we make a recommendation of, hey, you should add this SCP, you want to see what that will do, right? And if you're running an SCP, you want to try it out and say, well, what if I had an event from this region or from that region, or if I change this tag or this condition, what will actually happen? And so now with the simulator, you can very quickly play and test with all that. So you can create mock SCPs, attach them where you'd like. You can move an existing SCP up to a different level and play with it. You can try disabling an SCP you already have and see the impact of that. And then you can import events from your system, from CloudTrail or whatever, or you can create mock events, or we've got really simple ways to do that, just so you can really play with it and see how it works. That's the key capability. It was fun to bring together, a huge amount of work, not an easy thing to create or build. Like there's so many event types, possibilities, combinations, conditions, edge cases, etc. We worked through. We built thousands and thousands of tests. We scoured for, worked with customers, used our own environments, create, scoured the web for lots of different SCPs or event stacks or other things to really iron that out to a place where it's working incredibly well for a whole bunch of really complex cases to see how the flow of those SCPs work. And I think you could see it in people's eyes when we were showing them, like, ooh, like it's like, wow, that's what I need. This is really, really hard to do without that type of capability. So yeah, it's really exciting.
Yeah, I know, John. I mean, you've led a cloud team at a large telecom, and you were demoing that at Amazon reInvent. So, any commentary about like your prior experience, if you had something like this in your hands when you're at the cloud team, or the feedback at the reInvent booth?
Anytime you're going to make a change, it's the balance of the risk of inaction versus the risk of the action you're taking, right? And so everybody wants to improve their security preventive posture, but that means making a change to production, and everyone's worried about breaking production when they do so. Mm-hmm. When it comes to SCPs and organization level things in general, the potential, the pros and cons are the potential impact of the change. The more things you can affect, the more effective the prevention. But on the flip side, the more risky it is to make that change from the perspective of breaking something. The simulator is a great way for you to get confidence in the change before you make it. You can see what it would do. The main thing you want is not to have any surprises once you push the button. Going live with the new prevention should be a non-event. And there's a lot of people that are paralyzed by that fear of breaking something when it comes to changes, especially at the organization layer. They're fairly confident that it's not going to break anything, but you don't know until you put it into place. The simulator gives you an opportunity to take your actual CloudTrail logs, run them against the proposed change, and see what it would have done. So the response from people was great. Everybody that I talked to, it was one of the features that they really were excited about, because if you make one bad change, right, you're trying to improve your preventive posture, and you make 100 good changes, and then there's one that causes issues, that slows you down for months afterwards. And so anything you can do to gain confidence in the change before you implement it is great. And I think the simulator is an awesome addition. That we're talking about adding more tools for simulation in the product as well as extending those capabilities because they're hugely valuable.
A personal story, at Amazon reInvent, that was like a last minute demo to run. And we're in this demo environment that has a lot of changes. SCPs are coming and going for all these different use cases that we have across different demos. And one of my actions was blocked. And and I was demoing in Amazon. And in Amazon, you just get this like really vague error message. It's like this action was blocked by a service control policy. That's it. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get this demo working. I literally only had like a few minutes before it started, and I took the CloudTrail event from that deny. I put it in the simulator. It then read where I was being blocked, which SCP, and because I had rights in the org, again, it's just a demo environment. I was just like quickly disabled it. It was someone else, that had enabled it as part of the demo. So I was like, literally within like a minute or two, I was able to go through that whole flow, find it, know where exactly I was impacted, and then take action on it. Yeah, I was like, without that, I would have been host.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
so much stuff is ephemeral in nature that you can't even look at what's out there to know whether the thing would be effective. You
No.
need to know what's
Yeah.
happening, and there's a difference in how things were 10 years ago and how they are now in terms of how you build software. So stuff is deployed all the time, and so something gets blocked at deployment. It's not like it get blocked once a year. It's whenever you do the rollout. So being able to simulate it against the logs as opposed to just looking at the current view of the environment is necessary in the way things operate today.
Excited to see that more will be coming into the product there. Yeah, immensely valuable. On Thursday, we re-announced a lot of the features that Guardrails started with, and that's what we call runtime prevention controls. And so, Guardrails has always kind of started as this, hey, we got to take immediate action in order to burn down your alerts. So this idea of detect and correct is a big part of preventing a risky action long term. And, as part of the multiple layers within your prevention scope, where you start from build, access layer, config, there's also this runtime. So things that you might have passed through the multiple layers, but now you have a misconfiguration. How are you going to actually prevent it from being long lasting? And so this concept of runtime controls, we literally have over 13,000 of them within the products of policies to manage them. And so excited to kind of re-announce this feature, but in the light of preventative controls. And so, basically, I wanted just to kind of throw it out there for John, just to kind of talk through like, why are runtime controls important here? You talked earlier about like, okay, you got a build, you can get scored for a build control or an access control, but then you also have this, well, if something's already existing and that's misconfigured, or when should you actually do a detect and correct type of runtime control? So you just talk us through like, how should people think about this runtime guardrail that you could set versus doing things ahead of time?
When you think about prevention, we're trying to think holistically. So you're trying to think about depth, and you're trying to think about catching things as early as possible, like at the build layer, all the way through at the runtime layer, at the last minute where you can check things. So it's not an either or decision in most cases. It's not this or that, but these things can work in combination. In terms of the value of the runtime layer stuff that we have in Guardrails, so there's a couple things that make it compelling. One, it will correct things that are already broken. You can use access layer things to avoid misconfiguration in the future, but you're stuck with the misconfiguration that exists. Whereas the Guardrails controls can clean those up too. So they don't just detect and correct as it happens. They can also correct the stuff. So using them in tandem with access layer policies can help you clean up old misconfigurations. The other thing is that they're just way more flexible. The SCPs and RCPs are limited to what's allowed in the policy language to do. And that has gotten more and more powerful over time. But there's just some stuff that you can't do per the policy language. And the level of granularity and the level of control that we have at the Guardrails layer exceeds what you can do at the policy layer. We can do things like time-based exceptions to them. Anything that you can do in the API, we can build into a control. And so when we talk about levels of granularity, security groups would be a good example, right? At the access layer, it would make sense to put in SCPs that restrict who can authorize security group ingress and egress, right? But if you want to get to the level of we only want to allow from internal addresses port 80 and 443, you can't do that in a policy, but you can do it in a guardrails control. So they provide a very granular ability to manage the environment that you just can't do at the level of some of those other things.
I mean, also, and if you're trying to prevent almost all of your objectives, like we were talking about benchmarks before, and there's a preventative benchmark around CIS, and if you're going to try to achieve that by putting all preventions on an SCP or RCPs, you actually wouldn't be able to because of policy limitations. You have so many that you can attach as well as character limitations, and so you do have to balance this, what's possible, but also your user experience. If you block every single thing, especially in every environment, it's going to hurt innovation, momentum for your dev teams. And so it is a balance to kind of consider maybe top level items that you should prevent to not ever introduce that as a problem versus maybe just cleaning things up underneath the developers and handling it after the fact. As long as you can do it quickly, which is why the runtime preventions, run within seconds. It's not something that sits there for like a day or even hours.
They mutate things in place essentially, right? Like some things we can just change on the fly. We don't have to destroy or not allow. So they're also more flexible in that respect, right? And in terms of an SCP, you usually just don't allow the request, but there's no way in that policy language to mutate the request, right? Like Azure policy allows you to do that. So some organization access layer stuff allows you to do that, but AWS really doesn't. But our guardrails essentially do that. They detect in near real time, usually within seconds, minutes at the most, that there's been a change. And we can change it non-destructively in some cases, which is an advantage as well.
With these type of controls that we introduced this week, I'll throw it to Nathan. Wrap up, how are enterprise security teams going to think differently about this? Like you had mentioned earlier that, right now we're kind of in like this detection mode and we have good visibility and we're chasing alerts, but with a focus on prevention first, and these multiple layers of preventing it, where do you see these teams day to day kind of shifting, and what could they do with these type of platform?
I think the big thing is changing your mindset from one of we're chasing these problems after they happened, we're in catch-up mode all the time, to one where you're thinking about how am I building the shielding my organization needs to stay safe. You can run around and fix the damage to your spaceship, or you can ensure you've got the shields turned on and working well to prevent that damage happening in the first place, right? And I think overall, time spent building that shielding, it feels very positive. It feels like I'm bringing in the controls I want for my organization. I'm bringing in the protection my organization needs. I'm building a safer environment for us to be in versus chasing alerts, which is helpful because you got to fix those things. But it's a constant game of catch up and repair of damage that's already happened to the environment. So I think that's the first big shift to make. The second one is, as John spoke about, this holistic approach, right? Which is really, how do I do it through the different layers, right? So the safest way to keep yourself safe is to never even try doing that misconfiguration or silly thing in the first place. So stop it at build time. Don't even desire it. Don't even try. The next safest place to do it is to stop it from being allowed to create. That's an access time prevention. No, you are not allowed to do that. And I will prevent you from even attempting, like from ever trying it through whatever mechanism, console, infrastructure code, doesn't matter. I'm going to block it. The third level you want to do it is maybe configuration of the cloud service itself. So, you're not allowed to configure it that way. So I'll stop you from having a public thing or whatever and doing settings there. And that's useful. Comes after access. It's powerful, etc. But those things are often, as we mentioned, very black and white, very binary, right? And they're not nuanced enough for large enterprises who need exceptions, need edge cases. Yes, it makes sense to let teams do security groups with fine-grained controls for the internal access. That's a good practice. You should do that. And if you've got to block them doing security groups altogether, now you're running around chasing process and etc. Or they're not doing fine-grained stuff anymore. It just doesn't make sense. So you're trying to find this balance, and that's where the runtime preventions are just so powerful, right, to complement that and do those sorts of things. So, hey, block it whenever you can, prevent it, etc., as best you can, and eventually fix it or correct it to give people more and more flower and flexibility. But your story needs to span that whole universe because that's the only way you can have enough power and flexibility to stop yourself just having to chase alerts all the time. And as I mentioned at the start, like you want, I think, as a security team, I want to be focused on how am I building the right protections for my organization to stop this thing happening. There's a reason we deploy firewalls. There's a reason we've built all of those tools over years. And now in the cloud, we're running around cleaning up afterwards. We never traditionally did it that way. That's not how we work. We just need to mature ourselves into a world of prevention in the cloud as well, right? We need visibility to what's wrong. It's amazing having those CNAPP tools or other things. They're great, but they're also after, right? And we've got to start thinking about how we're going to invest in the before.
Exciting to see us helping these enterprises kind of achieve that at scale. On Friday, anytime we wrap up a launch week, we also have a B-side. So everything we talked about was A-sides. We also have a B-sides, which is just a heap of collection of changes that we made across Turbot Guardrails that we didn't announce, Turbot pipes, as well as all of our open source projects. So Steam pipe, power pipe, flow pipe, tailpipe, anything from B-sides that stood out. I know you work on like a lot of the mods, community contributions, anything that stood out to you or something to call out?
Yeah, for me, there's two main highlights. One is just continuing to increase our coverage across the different mods and services within Guardrails. AWS, Azure, all of them, they continue to move so fast every day, every week, every month. So hard to keep up. So in general, just us staying up to date, whether it's something that a customer is asking for, or it's coming from maybe a benchmark, or something as we're just watching new APIs come through, or new features that are being announced constantly. Just I think in general, for me, it feels good to kind of stay on top of that and just kind of remaining current, up to date, adding new policy types to help users get control or implement these runtime preventions for the new stuff coming out for especially the core services or the very common, important ones that organizations rely on day to day. The second part that really stood out to me, as always, and I'm just always so happy and grateful to see just community contributions, especially for a lot of our open source products. So when looking at Steam pipe plugins or power pipe mods, just a lot of activity around people asking for things, reporting issues, but also a lot of people submitting pull requests to us, which I'm always, again, super happy to see that people are invested enough, they care about it, and they're also taking the time and effort to contribute back and add fixes, add entire new features, sometimes to the core, like the CLIs themselves. People are submitting stuff out that in there too. So in general, just happy to have that level of community engagement, and we're reviewing and happily taking that in, and overall then that's just providing a lot of value back to us and everyone else who uses the different plugins and the PowerPipe mods, etc., across the ecosystem.
It just is incredible. I mean, the type of community we have. So we have our Turbot Slack community, and we get questions every single day, and we get good feedback. And then the GitHub issues, the pull requests, even like in our docs, like folks just contributing back to our documentation, which is great. And I know John appreciates that. And with those community contributions, I don't know, Nathan, if you maybe had anything that you wanted to call out specifically, or any other anecdotes from our community conversations at reInvent. Oh, you're on mute, bud. Yeah.
It's so fun that reInvent when you work working there, and people came up and we asked them to come say hi. Oh, they could get some our secret Steam pipe swag or whatever we had, etc., which was really great. Or get the selfie with like the people who made Steam pipe and stuff. So it's just so nice to have that positive feedback from people, which was great. But to me, the big thing from looking around, Cody, our vision was that it's really hard doing this sort of checking and visibility at this sort of scale. And we believed that there was a lot of room to create a product set that allowed people to contribute to that quickly and freely, and develop it together, because the edge cases are kind of insane. And you can really feel that working. You're just getting, so many issues, PRs, all that sort of stuff from all the edges you can imagine across so many different products and dimensions or services here. And so to me, that's the big thing. And then people writing about it. It's so valuable to us when you just write about these tools and tell people about how they helped you solve your problem, etc. So, I'm just super grateful for people doing that. And I'm really impressed at the scale of it. So it was a bit less this time of like, wow, someone did one massive thing. But to me, the big thing that stood out this time was just the massive range of contributions and the number of people involved at this point. It just feels really fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, agree. Yeah, and it was great to kind of connect with folks in person, this time around within reInvent. So, and that was always great to see and give out some special stickers and pins there. That wraps up our launch week 11. Again, fantastic launch week. Great way to close out 2025. I know we have a number of interesting launch weeks that are prepped for or being planned for 2026. And so, again, appreciate all of you for joining the wrap up party and look forward to working with you guys further in 2026 on the next launch week.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Talk soon.